Welcome to Rainbow Records, a show about the stories of queer people who lived through the AIDS crisis in Los Angeles. I'm your host, Analisa Venolia. Our guest for this episode is Tim Miller. Tim is an internationally recognized gay performance artist and instructor. He founded the performance art space Highways in Santa Monica, as well as Performance Space New York, and he was involved with both ACT UP LA and ACT UP New York. He's also famously one of the NEA 4, a group of 4 queer artists who had National Endowment of the Arts grant money revoked and took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. He was kind enough to share his experiences with me, so let's dive right in.
I'm Tim Miller. I'm a solo performer, educator, community organizer. I grew up in Los Angeles County and in Whittier, California, and I am 66.
To start us off, could you tell me what it was like coming of age as a queer person in LA County?
I'm in high school and I'm really coming of age kind of mid and late 70s, which is a real golden period in American culture. We won the counterculture war. Feminism and lesbian and gay civil rights are dominating the discussion. There's no such thing as the religious right in the popular discourse. My high school, which was a big, LA County high school, we had 2,500 students. I was in a great books program, but which was where all the queer people were. We were out to each other, though I didn't have a boyfriend until I was 17. And, I was a good kid, a good student, but I was wearing, purple nail polish to school and when I'm 14. The idea that we were heading towards an absolute nightmare with Reagan and the rise of the religious right in just a few years would have seemed bizarre to me. In the 70s, it felt like we were going to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Women would be protected in the U.S. Constitution. Gay people would have full civil rights by the end of the decade, and how wrong I was. So I had a pretty easy time of it. People 10 years younger than me had a much harder time of it. Coming out amid a global pandemic in 1984 was immeasurably harder. And with a lunatic fascist Republican Party using gay people as political footballs and a President Reagan that would let, 80,000 Americans die before he said the word AIDS. So in some ways, I feel very historically quite lucky in how I threaded the needle of coming out after, I was 10 years old when Stonewall happened. But I was at the first, a year later, I was on Hollywood Boulevard at the first gay pride. Pride in LA was the beginning of what we think of as pride marches. And also growing up in LA and in California, which was clearly the center of LGBTQ civil rights in our country. A generation ahead of New York City, all the first civil rights ordinances are in California. We won a proposition protecting gay people in 1978. It's just these amazing victories. If you were coming from LA or San Francisco in that period, you were coming from the most progressive place for queer people in the world, certainly, and really the most progressive in this country.
And could you describe for me what life was like as a young gay artist before the discovery of AIDS in the US? And how did your life change afterwards?
I think I just felt so excited by the world. And, I knew the world was chaotic and dangerous. And I wasn't naive about that. I was not Candide, the naive optimist of Voltaire's book. But I was also pretty blithe and feeling like the world was going to unfold in interesting ways. And in, the 70s, the world was being created by feminism and queer liberation. It was such an exciting moment. And I talk about AIDS as being like Titanic hitting the iceberg of suddenly this thing that I did not see coming and thing that, I had zero narrative that I was going to run into a global pandemic that would potentially kill me by 25. That was a complete surprise. And that, in a way, becomes the comeuppance or the reality lesson of just how hard and complex the world is, and all the homophobia. There are plenty of gay people, gay men, who felt, that kind of internalized age shame of like, oh, this is God's punishment. I never for one second thought that. But It doesn't mean I wasn't incredibly afraid I was going to die, which I really, really was. My boyfriend at the time, John, who I also perform about a lot, shortly after we broke up, he was one of the very, very early people with AIDS. Only maybe 6 months after we broke up, John was in the hospital, which also then made me think, oh wow, well, if John's got it, I probably do too. At 22, I was really living assuming that I already had AIDS. It would finally turn out when I finally did get tested in 1990 that I was HIV negative, which came as a giant surprise. I really thought that was impossible. But I was assuming, that my days were numbered. And that meant it's a really rich period of creative work and doing pieces about AIDS and about my life as a gay person. It was a period of a lot of anxiety and waking up in the middle of the night and starting to have the, health paranoia. And it informed in some ways probably my decision to move back to LA in 1987 after 9 years in New York, just because, my homing impulse was strong. And, I also thought if I'm going to get sick, I need to be near my family.
Speaking about your creative work, tell me about your art and how queerness informs your art.
I was a theater kid in a very conventional way, but I pretty quickly realized if I wanted to tell my gay stories and bring my gay politics into my work, the existing literature didn't exist. And it just became clear that I was going to have to do it myself, be one of the people who helped create this solo performance genre, which started to really take over the world, in the 80s as I kind of arrived in New York. And I was one of the extremely early autobiographical performance people that was getting a lot of attention. I was the wild young one from California. So that in a way is where it came from. It's where I can't separate my gay identity, my queer self, my activist self from my performer self. And all the first pieces I do in New York are about being gay and about bringing that to life. Also coming out of a really rich history of left-wing performance protest and civil disobedience, it was such a perfect match. I'd in some ways been preparing for that experience my whole life up to that point, which I wasn't yet 30 when I went to my first Act of New York meeting. I think I was at the third meeting of Act of New York. ACT UP arrives pretty powerfully, in 1987, but there'd already been 6 years and I was in New York City, so it's literally from July 81, with the first New York Times story. There'd already been many years. And a lot of this was this urgency to claim your story, to imagine I'm not just a worthless person with AIDS. I'm not just a worthless, discardable gay man. My life matters, even if my life is short. It can be fierce, it can be powerful, it can have meaning. My period in ACT UP, both ACT UP LA and ACT UP New York, was built on 6 years of making stories about queer lives, having curated the first ever international gay performance festival in the world at Performance Space New York in 1980. I'd already been doing this work for years as a cultural worker and as an activist as well. And then ACT UP became a perfect vehicle for that. ACT UP LA was really intimately connected to performance and the creative community. It was hugely populated by artists and, really connected to highways and stuff. So when ACT UP LA and New York, my involvement in both really get going, I was already a very established performer. I got a lot of attention really quickly. So by the time ACT UP is arriving and the AIDS crisis, which also became my subject, a huge part of my subject, as it had to, because I thought I was going to be dead any minute. Um, that's the motor of my work, and it's certainly how I was seen. It's what fuels the heat and the politics of my work that would then bring me into the focus of the Bush administration and why they took away my National Endowment for the Arts grant in 1980s.
And speaking about ACT UP, could you tell me about how you got involved with the movement and what you saw your role as being?
When ACT UP came, I'd already been, very involved in anti-nuke stuff and, the Equal Rights Amendment. It's a bit of a hegemonic history, but Larry Kramer did that speech at the LGBT Center in New York. Basically, you're all going to die. You better storm the barricades, and it made a big impact. And then the March on Washington happened, and Act Up New York was the first chapter, and Act Up LA shortly after. And I'd already been involved with Act Up New York, but then as soon as Act Up LA got started, I was very involved. At first, in some ways, mostly as an artist, I raised a huge amount of money for Act Up LA. And Highways was the main fundraiser for ACT UP LA. Most of the money came from projects with Highways. We would do these mass parties where 4,000 or 5,000 people would come. We'd literally have bags full of cash to raise all this money that would then be properly deposited into Highways and then a check cut to ACT UP. Those years of ACT UP's peak, which is kind of 87 to 93 with the inauguration of Bill Clinton, when things just got better. And 3 years later, then the drugs changing everything and people mostly stopping dying. But in those kind of 5, 6 years, it's one of the most energized periods of my life. ACT UP was such a drama queen organization. Beautiful, dramatic rhetoric, actions, visuals, surprising kinds of direct action protests. I mean, literally, what a great idea for, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. I mean, there was no more right-wing person in the country than just Senator Jesse Helms, now mercifully dead. It was just such a great, imaginative, super creative drama queen kind of action to put a condom over his entire private residence. That kind of gesture was already kind of quite creative, Dada in a way, kind of anarchist kind of performance praxis. It's hard for me not to be nostalgic because it was the most energized period of activism for me in my life. I was a good kind of artist to have around. And then at that point, also one of the most attacked artists in the country made me a really useful ACT UP artist because I was suing the president and taking a case to the US Supreme Court. I was performing all over, kind of taking the queer ACT UP message far and wide.
Before we dive a little bit more into your experience as one of the NEA4, I'm really fascinated by ACT UP's use of art, and performance art in particular as a key part of the movement. Could you dive into that?
Both in New York and LA, there were lots of people involved in both ACT UP chapters. There were tons of Hollywood production people, performers, graphic designers. At the time, I was really aware that these were not necessarily fancy art world taken seriously artists. A lot of them were artists that were, just graphic designers or publicity people. And so there was, lots of people, tons of people doing work, especially in New York and LA and San Francisco. And as people kind of corralled that more to their AIDS activism, it was a huge, huge help. And also we were, on the cusp of the internet age. We suddenly had easier ways to make images, photocopying changes everything. Being able to computer typeset and create, their computers are around, and to make images and to manipulate them was incredibly, incredibly helpful. And ACT UP was really probably the first social movement in some ways of the computer age, because feminism is really a little bit before that. There was so much performance, both solo performance, Broadway musicals, giant plays. There was an incredible explosion of queer theater, partly because queer creative communities were being hit really hard. Every gay person felt at risk. And so suddenly you had all these artists, including, Hollywood people and Broadway people and ballet dancers, and the way these fields were being decimated meant the art world had to step up. And not that all creative people are gay, but certainly a heck of a lot of them are. So that kind of wove the arts creative communities into ACT UP really strongly, just because they were a really affected community. ACT UP was really cocky, knowing the full, complexity of that word. But in some ways, including it, ACT UP thought we are fabulous. We are so culturally adept, clever. We use the media for our own ends without spending any money. We know how to get on TV, very culturally savvy. All these strategies that in some ways had elements of Madison Avenue in them, and agitprop organizing. And I talk about when my NEA stuff happened, because I'd been very involved in a lot of ACT UP LA and also National ACT UP protests and on committees and stuff, I knew how you hone a message. I knew how to, okay, I'm now in my total moment of focus where I'm being interviewed by every news channel and national news and international news and People magazine and Vanity Fair. So ACT UP was very smart about all that, which is graphic representation, sound bites, powerful. The power of performance, of gathering people is really crucial. And that's not a new organizing tactic. But ACT UP was super, super good at it. And if you were an artist and you were a queer person and you were afraid you were going to die, there were few better kinds of formations to have, to be part of, to let things feel like you could do something.
So I noticed in your piece, Stretch Marks, that the ACT UP shirt you were wearing was in Spanish. It feels like so much of queer history is whitewashed, but based on that shirt, it seems like ACT UP, at least in some ways, recognized the intersectionality of the queer community. Could you elaborate on if that was actually the case?
It was the ACT UP LA shirt. And, largely because ACT UP LA was, more diverse than ACT UP New York. Not that ACT UP LA didn't have all the same familiar diversity growing pains and clumsiness and mess ups around race and gender and ableism. So there were all those stressors. On the other hand, both ACT UP LA, ACT UP New York were really, really great and interesting collaborative spaces where we're around queer men and queer women working together. Because that had gotten quite frayed through the, gay male culture, of course, can be, incredibly racist and misogynist, which had always frustrated and infuriated me enormously. But within the limits we all have at any moment in in a historical placement, ACT UP did try to address that. So all those stressors were there strongly in ACT UP. And, does printing your bilingual Silencio es Muerte shirt, how significant is that? How meaningful it is? It felt pretty meaningful because I'd show up in New York and basically every single Puerto Rican or Dominican person at the meeting would say, "Oh my God, we want one." Where is I got so that I would just bring them to New York.
Circling back to the topic of the NEA 4, for those who don't know what happened, could you describe the government revoking your grant money and all of what that entailed?
The so-called culture war, which starts in 89, 90, which is an old war. The U.S., we have the First Amendment and freedom of speech, but, the U.S. is very committed to censorship. About every 20 years, it crops up in a big way. But the culture war really gets rolling. It's linked to AIDS. Because partly why the culture war starts is because queer culture had gotten so energized in response to AIDS and so confrontational and more overtly sex positive and politically vigorous and critical of the government. It's what really gets people like right wing Senator Jesse Helms in North Carolina, gets them all worked up. It's because suddenly there's all this queer culture that's coming forward, and especially coming from either artists with AIDS like Robert Mapplethorpe. It was the first artist really attacked in 1989. And then me and Holly Hughes and John Fleck and Karen Finley, three of the four of us being lesbian or gay, and all four of us being queer in that larger, definition and stuff. So the culture war really begins because suddenly in the US, artists had gotten much feistier, more overtly political, more sexual, more naked. So it's sort of like the chicken and egg thing. I think people imagine that the culture war sort of created like more intense overt AIDS performance, but I think it's the opposite. I think what AIDS was asking artists to come up with was making us make work that was much more in people's faces and much less tolerating bullshit. There was a huge audience for the work, which means when my case happened, my grant taken away, it was maybe my 10th NEA grant. I'd performed all over the world for almost 10 years. The week before, I'd been on the cover of the Washington Post Arts section for a performance and a set of performances in DC. We were all very prominent artists. We were getting lots of attention. It's why it happened. They decided they would start pulling all the grants for anything that had queer representation or sexual text or nudity or whatever. But we responded, and we were the only case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Holly and John and Karen and I, the NEA 4 versus John Frohnmeyer and the U.S. government. We got our grants back at the federal circuit, at the second highest court, the Ninth Circuit. And then the general idea came from Jesse Helms that general standards of decency could be grounds for denying federal funding for the arts, which was not about us, but was the larger issue. We'd already gotten our checks for our grants and all court costs paid, for the ACLU who took our case. That we lost, and we lost big. And the 8-1 decided that general standards of decency could be grounds for taking someone's funding away creatively.
Drawing from your experiences with activism in art and fighting back against oppression, is there anything you want to tell young queer people today?
You have to be compassionate with yourself. As AIDS arrived, I was confused, horrified, mortal fear of my own demise. How can my beautiful, cute 25-year-old self die? Kind of the injustice, the horror, just right as I'm starting to make my life happen. It's natural to be overwhelmed. We're in a really overwhelming moment right now. But I think finding the strategies of how we keep our spirits up, how you keep kind of responding to the particularness of where we are now, come up with new things that people haven't done ever before, because of course the old strategies may just be old strategies that don't work anymore. And our new technologies are extremely useful, but you kind of need great images. It's in some ways not that different from 1848. You need great images, strong writers, strong points of view, people that are ready to risk their lives to make change happen. It feels like the most effective thing I can do right now, especially in my 60s, is to share strategies, performance approaches. I mostly am doing creative workshops, but it's about how do we make performance that changes the world, that engages the world. I mean, it's such a big question, but those are the things right now I keep wanting to encourage is what's your story to tell? What's your passion? What's the social justice discourse that you want to make?
That reminder to be compassionate to yourself is really valuable. Thank you, Tim Miller, for sharing your story. For those interested in seeing some of Tim's pieces, I've included a link in the description to his website. This has been Rainbow Records. Until next time.